Now we're going to talk some more about the concept of a path. We've been talking a little bit about this, and we've established that it's like an address, or it's a location somewhere on our computer. Different operating systems format paths differently. Notably, on Windows, you'll have a backslash separating your directories, so it'll look like something like this, for example. On Linux, on the other hand, we have a forward slash, but the concept is still the same. Now, there are two different types of paths, relative and absolute paths. We've been using relative paths so far, but we're going to learn how to use both relative and absolute paths and how to distinguish amongst them. But first, let's talk about a minor point which will make our use of paths on the command line even more flexible. It turns out that we can specify that we want to navigate several directories with one command rather than just one at a time. So let's consider this particular example here. So I am currently in my home directory, and I want to navigate to my homework1 directory. So I can type this series of commands. First I go into my fall directory, then I go into my CS170 directory, then I go into my homework1 directory. And as we can see, I am now in my homework1 directory. Now, that's a lot of commands. There's 3 CD commands in that sequence just to get to one directory. It turns out that I can specify all of those directories, that hierarchy, all at once. So let me go back to my home directory here. As we can see, I'm in my home directory now. And what I can do instead of issuing 3 different CD commands is I can do it all at once by giving it a path to navigate. So in this case, I'm going to say cd fall slash cs170 slash homework1. So I'm specifying 3 directories all at once here on one command line. And as we can now see, I'm in fact in my homework1 directory. And obviously this is going to be much faster. So after this single command, I'm in my homework1 directory. Again, we use those forward slashes to distinguish the different directories. Now, if we wanted to move up 2 directories in our hierarchy, I can use my shortcut again and say move up once, move up another level, right? Again, 2 commands. And as you can see, I'm now in my fall directory. So let me go back into my homework1 directory. And instead of those 2 cd ... cd ... commands, what I can do instead is I can say cd ... /.. Okay, and that means cd to one directory up, and then from that directory, go up another directory. So again, I'm specifying these pieces all on one line with one command. So I'm using a more complicated path. And again, I'm in my fall directory here. So if I'm in my homework1 directory, okay, and I want to go to my homework2 directory in the CS170 folder, I can do cd ... /homework2. That takes me up one level to my CS170 directory, and then from that directory back down into my homework2 directory. So this gives us a pretty powerful tool to use when specifying paths. All right, now that we understand the concept of more complex paths, let's go ahead and talk about relative versus absolute paths. Relative paths specify a location relative to our current position or the current directory that we're in. So these are very powerful. We've already been using these with all of our commands so far. So if we're in our fall directory and we type the command cd cs170, the computer looks in our current directory, fall, finds a directory named CS170 and carries out our command. However, if we're in the root directory and we type cd CS170, the computer will look in our current directory, the root directory, and won't find it, and it will give us an error at that point. So let's demonstrate this concept. So I'm going to go to my root directory, and again, if I type pwd or if I type ls, we can see I'm not in my home directory. So at this point, if I type cd cs170, I'm saying, hey, I'm in the root directory, look for a directory CS170. And as you can see here, it says cd cs170, no such file or directory. Relative paths, again, are very useful. That's all we've been using thus far. If you look back at all of our commands, they specify a location relative to the current directory. On the flip side of that, what we have here we have absolute paths. Okay. Now, absolute paths specify the entire path through the directory hierarchy. All right. So we've learned that the file system begins with the root directory, which we specify with a single /. We've also learned that our files reside in the home directory. So to form an absolute path, we give the entire path through the system starting at the root directory. So in this case, an absolute path is going to look something like this. We start at the root directory, then we go into our home directory, and then we specify where we want to look for our files. Something like this, for example. We can use this path no matter where we are on in the current directory hierarchy, because we're specifying the entire location, the unambiguous location. So let's take a look at how this manifests. So I am currently in the root directory. Let me go back. I'll use my shortcut here to get back to my home directory. As we can see, I'm in my home directory. Now what I can do here is I can specify an entire path starting with the root directory. And in this case, I'm going to go into fall, let's say physics. Okay, one command, there I am. I want to change directory. Again, I can specify the entire absolute path to anything on my system, and I've accomplished that in one fell swoop. So you can always distinguish relative paths from absolute paths by looking at the first character. So for example, my absolute paths will always begin with that /. Relative paths, where I did something like CD CS170, note that it doesn't have a leading slash. However, if I do something like this, it does have that leading slash. So both of these commands, well, the first command might work depending on where I am in the directory hierarchy. The second command will always work to take me to that CS170 directory. Okay, so we can always use this sort of shortcut by looking at that first character. The only question here that we learned from our last discussion was about the tilde, which again we said that was a shortcut for our home directory. So what about a path where we do something like this and we say go to my home directory and then go to fall CS170, for example? Is this a relative path or absolute path? And in this case, this might seem a little bit tricky, but this is in fact an absolute path. Okay, now that's because of what goes on behind the scenes on the command line. What goes on behind the scenes here is that Linux sees that tilde and it's going to replace that with the absolute path to our home directory. So if we type something like this, cd:/fall/cs170, really that's the same as typing /home/vsummit, the path to our home directory, and then looking for fall CS170. So to recap, we learned more about paths and how to specify multiple directories in a single path. We've also learned about relative and absolute paths, how to use them with some of our commands, and how to distinguish what type of path is being used for a given command.